Good evening, everyone. Many thanks for your patience as we fixed some of the technical glitches. Tyler Conrad is the master behind my mix-ups here. So thank you so much for being here. And I would like to welcome you tonight to our event in the HRC speaker series on native ground, which is part of a larger initiative at the Humanities Research Center this year on the theme race, ethnicity, and social justice. My name is Cristina Stanche, and I'm an associate professor of English and the director of the Humanities Research Center. Also, happy Native American Heritage Month. As I said earlier, for his help behind the scenes, I'd like to thank Tyler Conrad, our event and communications manager in the College of Humanities and Sciences. Many thanks also to the alumni in the audience for their continued support of the HRC. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Departments of English, History, Sociology, the Media, Art, and Text PhD program, and the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs. My gratitude to all the chairs and program directors, including Dr. Catherine Gracia in English, Dr. John Powers in History, Dr. Susan Bodner-Darren in Sociology, Dr. Oliver Speck in MATX, and Dr. Miriam Kadeba, the director of ONSA. Our speaker series events, for those of you who are familiar with ours, are following a similar format. I will briefly introduce our guest, who will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions from the audience. And as our speaker proceeds, please feel free to use the Q&A function to post your questions during the talk, and we will take them in the order in which they are received. So on to our introductions. I'm very thrilled to welcome to the Humanities Research Center tonight one of my personal heroes, Professor Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who is an American historian, writer, and activist, Professor Emerita of Ethnic Studies at California State University, East Bay. She has been active in the international indigenous movement for more than 4 decades and has been committed to national and international social justice issues for decades. She is the winner of the 2017 Lannan Cultural Freedom Prize, and she's the author and editor of many books, including An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which received the 2015 American Book Award, and Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, published in 2018. When my students read An Indigenous People's History of the United States in Native literature classes, they confess that this is the most important and eye-opening book they've ever read. Professor Robin D.G. Kelly, the author of Freedom Dreams, also wrote that, and I quote here, "This may well be the most important US history book you will read in your lifetime," end quote. Diné scholar Jennifer Nez de Natale, professor at the University of New Mexico, also remarked that Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz writes, quote, "a masterful story that relates what the indigenous peoples of the United States have always maintained. Against the settler US nation, indigenous peoples have persevered against actions and policies intended to exterminate them, whether physically, mentally, or intellectually." Building on this work, the book she will share with us tonight is titled Not a Nation of Immigrants: Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion, which was published in August this year by Beacon Press. About this book, Columbia University professor Mahmoud Mamdani says, "A compelling counter-narrative to America's autobiography as the making of a nation of immigrants." Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz not only chips away at the settler account, but also provides the narrative glue for an emancipatory movement beyond the settler-native dichotomy, end quote. I'm very thrilled to welcome you to the Humanities Research Center at VCU tonight, Professor Dunbar-Ortiz.
Thank you so much, Professor Cristina Stanche. I'm really honored to be speaking at the Virginia Commonwealth University. I have never been there, but I hope to visit and wish I could be there with you right now. Thanks also to the departments of English, History, and Sociology, the Media, Art, and Text PhD program, and the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs at VCU. And greetings to everyone. Yes, A Nation of Immigrants is a mythology that covers up the actuality of settler colonialism. So I'm going to talk about what settler colonialism is and how it differs from immigration per se. So the late Australian anthropologist Patrick Wolfe emphasized in his groundbreaking research and writing on settler colonialism that it is a structure, not a one-time event. But in the case of the United States, settler colonialism was even more than a colonial structure that developed and replicated itself over time in the 170 years of British colonization in North America, preceding the founding of the United States. The founders were not unoppressed colonized people, as the claim goes. They were British citizens being restrained by their monarch from expanding the 13 colonies to enrich themselves, mainly plantation agriculture worked by enslaved people. They were imperialists. They were British, so they, of course, were imperialists who visualized the conquest of the continent and gaining access to the Pacific and ultimately to control the trade of China. Achieving those goals required land, wealth, and most important of all, full settler participation. They devised a unique plan manifest in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which was created during the War of Independence by the Continental Congress and reenacted at independence by the US Congress in 1789. Designed as what historian Howard Lamar called, quote, an internal colonial system for the West. Its provisions were borrowed in part from the British system of settler colonialism in Ulster, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the 13 North American colonies. However, this invention was something new. The constitutional construction of the settler republic, with both ethnic cleansing of the native presence to take the land and chattel slavery, producing racial capitalism. The Northwest Land Ordinance provided for eventual settler self-government once Euro-American settlers outnumbered the indigenous populations. This Land Act guaranteed to the settlers property, civil rights, religious freedom, trial by jury, representational legislation, and public education. That ultimate conclusion, however, was preceded by successive stages of colonial development. From first military ethnic cleansing and control to a federally appointed territorial government to a semi-representational government to finally admission into the United States as a state. This constituted a semi-self-governing unit of the Republic. Historian Howard Lamar observed that apologists for the US expansionism do not see the ordinance as a reflection of colonialism, but rather as a means of reconciling the problem of liberty with the problem of empire. As I pointed out, the founders were unapologetic imperialists, being British and British imperialism being all over the world. But the Euro-American British added the conceit of an empire for liberty, as Thomas Jefferson conceived the imperialist future. Historian David Reynolds writes that Jefferson believed the United States empire was destined to assume the responsibility to spread freedom around the world, starting with the North American continent and intervening abroad. United States foreign policy was stamped with this concept from the beginning and has provided the ideological motivation for all US wars and interventions since then. Through the Northwest Ordinance, the United States created a unique land system among colonial powers, including Britain. In the US system, land itself, not just what was produced from the land, such as agriculture, mining, logging, grazing, and so on, but land was the most important exchange commodity for the accumulation of capital and building the national treasury. In order to comprehend the apparently irrational genocidal policy of the US government toward the presence of native nations on the land, the centrality of land sales in building the economic base of the US capitalist system must be the frame of reference. The policy was embedded in the design of the constitutional republic. Although private property and land had long been a fact of life in Europe and in some other places, it was demarcated by the contour of streams and rivers, tree lines, rock formations, and mountains, and was reserved for the economic and political elite. The United States, being founded as a settler colonial fiscal military state, created something new under the sun: the plat system of privatizing land into marketable units, real estate. The Northwest Ordinance spawned the Public Land Survey System, a unique surveying method to plat, that is, divide land, transforming it into property for sale and settling. Plots of 160 acres with sections of 4 plots, or 640 acres. As the US took more land with the Louisiana Purchase, the Oregon Territory, and half of Mexico, the government promised free land to Europeans and Euro-Americans for the purpose of recruiting and motivating settlers to squat on indigenous peoples' lands. With indigenous resistance to the squatters, the army would be dispatched. The pieces of paper called deeds representing units of land made up the commodity market that built the United States capitalist system and remains its central factor today. The other main commodity until 1860 was human, the enslaved body of the African enslaved person also had its deed of sale that was exchanged on the stock market. Historian Donald Harmon Atkinson aptly describes the implementation of the Northwest Land Ordinance. Its importance was equal to that of the trumpet-toned Constitution of 1787, but it did not deal with the ethereal concepts such as the pursuit of happiness, but instead declared in very practical terms how the land from the Appalachian Mountains up to the Mississippi River was to be conquered. This was to be done by surveyors' chains, each 22 yards in length, The measuring began at an arbitrary point in the Ohio Territory, and invisible lines were drawn on the land to form a grid of perfect rectangles marked by cairns or iron bars and the occasional brass plate cemented onto a masonry base. Each of the rectangles had its own map reference. And as the United States Imperium expanded, the grid eventually reached the Pacific coast and stretched between Mexico and British North America. The lines on the land not only conquered natural topography, but also made possible the liberation of parcels of land from their previous occupants and their efficient allocation to newcomers. This was the implementation of what has been called the fiscal military state. That is, a capitalist colonialist state made for war. From the beginning of the surveys in the newly claimed Northwest Territory to the Pacific Ocean, the lands claimed by the surveys were already populated with indigenous peoples in villages with their farms from tens of thousands of years. But the land was treated as terra nullius, unpopulated land. While the indigenous nations and communities reduced in numbers by genocidal warfare, they caused displacement, starvation, crowded refugee situations, and resultant infectious diseases, were forced into army-guarded reservations dependent on government rations. The indigenous peoples of the large native agricultural nations of the South were forcibly relocated to west of the Mississippi, followed by the forced relocation of all of the indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi. This is important for understanding not only how settler colonialism defines the United States and all its institutions, but also, as Mahmoud Mamdani has documented, that, quote, all of the defining institutions of settler colonialism as practiced in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries were first developed in North America. The US tribal homeland was the prototype not only for the South African Reserve, but also the Nazi concentration camps, which were designed after using the US model. It was also the template for establishing the State of Israel. During the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln did not forget his free soiler bases who had brought him to that high office. Free soil, that term, meant free of chattel slavery for white commercial farmers like Lincoln's family, who could not afford to purchase enslaved bodies. Congress, at Lincoln's behest, passed the Homestead Act in 1862. This is during the height of the Civil War fighting, as well as the Morrill Act, the latter transferring large tracts of indigenous land to the states to establish land-grant universities. The Pacific Railroad Act provided private companies with nearly 200 million acres of indigenous land that was taken without treaties. With these massive land grabs taken without treaties, the US government broke multiple already existing treaties with indigenous nations whose people were still living there. It would take genocidal military force to evict them. Most of the Western territories, including Colorado, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, were delayed in achieving statehood because indigenous nations resisted appropriation of their lands and outnumbered the settlers. until they didn't. So the colonization plan for the West established during the Civil War was carried out over the following 3 decades of war and land grabs. So the history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism. The objective of settler colonialism is to terminate indigenous peoples as nations and communities with land bases in order to make the land available to European settlers. Extermination and assimilation were the methods used. A kind of innocence characterizes the erasure and continued settler colonialism. It still exists today, it's not just history. Romanticizing settler sovereignty is a way of erasing colonialism and indigenous nations, and is a tendency as much on the left or liberal spectrum as on the right and conservative. Just as John F. Kennedy's book, A Nation of Immigrants, ushered in a new liberal era, so too did his romantic rhetoric about settlers as he reached the presidency. In accepting his nomination in the 1960 Democratic presidential as the Democratic presidential candidate in Los Angeles, he said, "I stand tonight facing west on what was once the last frontier, from the lands that stretch 3,000 miles behind me. The pioneers of old gave up their safety, their comfort, and sometimes their lives to build a new world here in the West. We stand today on the edge of a new frontier." Echoing Kennedy in an attempt to revive frayed liberalism, Barack Obama, in his 2009 presidential inaugural address, also romanticized settlers, even including enslaved Africans as settlers. He said, "In reaffirming the greatness of our nation, we understand that greatness is never a given. It must be earned. Our journey has never been one of shortcuts or settling for less. It has been the risk takers, the doers, the makers of things. For us, they packed up their few worldly possessions and traveled across oceans in search of a new life. For us, they toiled in sweatshops and settled the West, endured the lash of the whip, and plowed the hard earth. For us, they fought and died in places like Concord and Gettysburg, Normandy, and Quai Sam." Settler colonialism is in the present. As Alyosha Goldstein observes, it is not, quote, a relic of the past, but a historical condition remade at particular moments of conflict in the service of securing certain privileges, and often to symbolically negotiate inequalities among white people. A deep psychosis inherent in US settler colonialism is revealed in settler self-indigenization. The phenomena is not the same as the practice of playing Indian, which historian Philip Deloria brilliantly dissected, from the Boston Tea Party Indians to hobbyists dressing up like Indians to New Age Indians. Settler self-indigenization genealogy can be traced to the period of the mid-1820s and to the 1840s, what historians call the age of democracy. Andrew Jackson's administration, marked by, among other phenomena, the blossoming of US American literature. The giants of the era are well known to every US high schooler who has had to suffer through American lit classes with Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman, Longfellow, Hawthorne, and dozens of others. Among them was James Fenimore Cooper, who was born in 1789, the year independence and died in 1851. He conjured the United States origin story in his Leatherstocking Tales, made up of 5 novels featuring the hero Natty Bumppo, also called variously depending on his age, Leatherstocking, Pathfinder, Deerslayer, and Hawkeye. Together, the novels narrate the mythical forging of the new country from 1754-1763 French and Indian War to independence, to the settlement of the plains by migrants traveling by wagon train from Tennessee. At the end of the saga, Bumppo dies a very old man on the edge of the Rocky Mountains as he gazes east. But it is the last of the Mohegans, subtitle A Narrative of 1757, that relates the self-indigenization myth that has endured. Behind the legend was Daniel Boone, a looming real-life figure, the archetype that inspired Cooper in the creation of his hero. Boone is the icon of settler colonialism. His life spanned from 1734 to 1820, precisely the period covered in the Leatherstocking series. Boone was born in the shadow of the Appalachians in Berks County, Pennsylvania, on the edge of British colonial settlement. He was an avatar of the moving settler indigenous frontier. To the west lay Indian country, claimed to the doctrine of discovery by Spain, Britain, and France, but free of European settlers, save for a few traders, trappers, and soldiers manning colonial outposts. Daniel Boone himself was of Welsh heritage, born in Pennsylvania, but most of those who followed his migrations, his illegal migrations under British law, west into the Appalachians, were Scots-Irish, Ulster Scots. The Scots-Irish had been the settler colonialists of Northern Ireland. Beginning in the early 1600s, the British decided to force Protestantism on the Catholic Irish. They chose to use lowland Scottish Presbyterians, offering them free land if they could push the Irish Catholics off their land. When British colonization of North America began, many of these Ulster Scots chose to join. They were seasoned usurpers of indigenous Irish property. The Western migration of Scots-Irish settlers represented a mass movement between 1720 and the War of Independence. During the last 2 decades of the 18th century, first and second generation Scots-Irish settlers continued to migrate to the Ohio Valley, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. They cleared forests, built log cabins, and killed Indians, taking their cultivated land. Historian Carl Degler wrote, "These hardy, God-fearing Calvinists made themselves into a veritable human shield of colonial civilization." Richard Slotkin finds the origin of US nationalism in the late 18th century trek of those settlers over the Appalachians, Allegheny Spine. Daniel Boone, Slotkin writes, became the most significant, most emotionally compelling myth hero of the early republic. The US American hero as the lover of the spirit of the wilderness, and his act of love and sacred affirmation are acts of violence against that spirit and her avatars. In the 20th century, reformation of this archetype, promoted notably in the writings of Theodore Roosevelt and of course in Western novels and films, the archetypes can be identified of the hunter, the farmer, the breeder, and especially the man who knows Indians and is practically an Indian himself in his mind, a replacement, self-indigenization. Indeed, it is rare even today to meet a descendant of the old settler trekking culture who does not identify Daniel Boone as a direct ancestor, the blood ancestor. Just as Boone had been hired by land speculators in 1775 to lead settlers illegally under British law over the Appalachians to what became Kentucky in 1799, he had led settlers from Kentucky to Spanish-claimed Upper Louisiana, which was seized by Napoleon in 1803 and sold to the United States as the Louisiana Purchase following the Haitian Revolution. Boone died in 1820 in Missouri, a year before it became a state of the United States. His body was ritually taken for burial to Frankfort, Kentucky, the covenant heart of the Ohio country, Indian country, the Shawnee homeland for which the revolution had been fought and which he had been the trekker supreme superhero, almost a deity. Boone became a celebrity in 1784 at the age of 50, a year after the end of the War of Independence. Real estate entrepreneur John Filson, seeking settlers to buy property that was inhabited by indigenous farmers and their villages in the Ohio country, wrote and self-published The Discovery, Settlement, and Present State of Kentucky, along with a map to guide the squatters. The book contained an appendix about Daniel Boone, purportedly written by Boone himself, although Boone is never known to have written anything. That part of the book on Boone's adventures subsequently was published as The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone in the American Magazine in 1787, then as a book, a best-selling book. Thereby a superstar was born, the mythical hero, the hunter. The Hunters of Kentucky, a popular song that swept the nation in 1822 to 1828, helped elect Scots-Irish Andrew Jackson as president by associating him with Boone, the hero of the West. Yet Cooper's positive twist on genocidal colonialism was based on the reality of invasion, squatting, attacking, and colonizing the indigenous nations. Neither Filson nor Cooper created that reality. Rather, they created the narratives that captured the experience and imagination of the Anglo-American settler, stories that were surely instrumental in nullifying guilt related to genocide and set the pattern of narrative for future US writers, poets, and historians. The site of the mythology that Cooper channeled was the Appalachian Mountains, with their passages to the rich lands of the Ohio Valley, where British settlers were barred from making claims after the French and Indian War. The 1763 Royal Proclamation ordered all those who had moved into that region to return to the colonies. Defying the proclamation, George Washington, who was head of the Virginia Colonial Militia, took survey teams into the area to map the territory for future settlement, which by definition meant the extension and expansion of slavery. By the time he was in his mid-20s, George Washington was already a notoriously successful slaver and land speculator in unceded Indian lands. The wealthy slavers of the Southern colonies, particularly those in Virginia, were most incensed by the order, the proclamation, barring their expansion. Since their wealth relied on accessing more and more land as they depleted the soils with intensive monocrop, non-food production, like cotton and tobacco for the market. The slavers also had an interest in decreasing the growing numbers of disgruntled landless white settlers, many of whom had already trekked into the illegally squatted in the Appalachian part of the Cherokee Nation. These mostly Scots-Irish settlers in the Appalachians became the mythologized settler archetype identified with Daniel Boone, claiming to be the original settlers, a self-indigenizing process. This is what has been called the settler move to innocence. Daniel Boone's lore is at the heart of the romanticizing of settler colonialism in Appalachia. In the newest iteration of the mythologizing of white Appalachian settlers and their descendants, historian Stephen Stoll first acknowledges the brutality of the forced removal of indigenous nations from east of the Mississippi, and concedes that as Aboriginal nations, indigenous peoples differed from the plight of the Scots-Irish settlers. He recognizes that Native nations were uprooted and removed by the federal government as peoples, whereas the Scots-Irish were individual settlers who took what Stoll implies was ethnically cleansed vacant land and created their own agrarian civilization. Stoll then leaves the tragic past of indigenous presence and settler colonial violence and posits a new people, echoes of Cooper's tales. The people of the mountains, who he claims resemble the peasants of feudal England who experienced foreclosure of the commons that had been provided by their lords. Yet Stoll continually argues that there are parallels in US policy toward the presumed peasants of Appalachia and the experience of Native nations. He writes, both groups were cast as degenerate races with no capacity for historical progress. Neither Scots-Irish cattle herders nor Chickasaw maize gardeners could be brought into the circulation of capital without shedding their rootedness in locality and their household sufficiency. Indian territorial sovereignty conflicted with the expansion of cotton and slavery. Mountaineer Scots-Irish kinship made some of the same kinds of claims on the landscape as home place. Neither group made much sense to an emerging concept of land as a commodity. Most of all, perhaps, both underwent an intellectual dispossession that preceded the one that actually took away the land. Stoll portrays the white, mostly Scots-Irish settlers in the middle and southern Appalachians as subsistent agrarians and hunters. He concedes that they engaged in market exchange, selling livestock and lumber, but claims that they did not become dependent on the cash and credit economy that dominated the rest of the United States. He characterizes them as swiddeners, an anthropological term indicating slash and burn agriculture, another indigenous marker. After drawing a picture of this near idyllic society, Stoll launches into a global history of enclosure of the commons. Throughout the book, he applies the already somewhat romanticized histories of the feudal period of the English commons and the enclosure movement that fenced the commons and privatized the land, throwing the peasants into a surplus labor force and launching British capitalist economy. Stoll characterizes the colonial settlers of Appalachia and their descendants as peasants who experienced enclosure with the arrival of coal and timber industries in the late 19th century. The final chapter is titled The Fate of the Commons and the Commoners. He compares this process to the fenced removal of indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi to Indian territory and to the Dawes Act that divided all common native land into marketable allotments. In doing so, Stoll disappears the native and bestows indigeneity upon these settlers. But Stoll didn't create the idea of self-indigenizing settlers. It is a phenomenon that harkens back to the mythologizing of Daniel Boone and the US origin story. Then it took a new form in the aftermath of the Civil War when Reconstruction waned, as did the possibilities of Black equality. The mountain people, as a pocket of whiteness, took on a demographic category in the minds of northern elites when the railroads brought industry into the mountains. The whiteness of the population, 90% of Appalachia is white today. The whiteness of the population appeared as unspoiled Americana, as opposed to the foreignness of the flood of Eastern and Southern European immigrants arriving. The coal mining industry took over and transformed the white settler population into heroic white miners. White labor organizing and union militancy marked the culture of whiteness. With economic depressions and competition in the coal industry, the West Virginia coal industry waned, as did the labor movement, leaving the mountain people impoverished, many migrating to Cincinnati, Chicago, and other industrial centers. In the late 1960s, the war on poverty turned attention to white poverty in Appalachia. The Black Civil Rights Movement in the South branched out to the North and the entire country, radicalizing many young white people. At the same time, the US decade-long covert military intervention in Southeast Asia became outright war mobilization in 1964. Already many on the left in the United States and Europe were committed anti-imperialists and supported the national liberation movements and anti-apartheid in South Africa. At the intellectual level, development theory that Europe had underdeveloped the third world gained traction, so much so that the United Nations established the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Out of the thinking on the development and underdevelopment, the concept of internal colonization was theorized by Mexican sociologist Pablo González Casanova in 1964 and became popularized. In general, the designation of internal colony was racialized, indicating the impoverishment and powerlessness of African Americans living in so-called ghettos, as well as Mexican Americans living in so-called barrios. In New Mexico, which is a very different situation than Mexican Americans, with the Hispanos as original Spanish settlers, was also considered an internal colony. But anti-poverty scholars and activists also applied it to white Appalachians, coinciding with the revival of self-indigenization in Appalachia. What set off the current Appalachian settler appropriation of indigeneity was the 1962 publication of a book, Night Comes to the Cumberlands, a biography of a depressed region by Kentucky lawyer Harry Caudill. In Ramp Hollow, Stephen Stoll praises the book, writing, quote, "After the book's publication, Caudill kept Appalachia before the public." He certainly did. In a 1967 article, Caudill wrote, quote, "The colonialist sway in the rest of the world has ended. Only in our Appalachia does it proceed unchecked." This was a period when most of Southern and West Africa remained under the boot of European colonialism. And it was 13 years before Zimbabwe won independence, not to speak of Native Americans enclosed on reservations. Caudill called white people of Appalachia indigenous mountaineers who have lived in the plateau since the beginning, unquote. He went on, "Much of the pioneer society in this mountainous region had resided in the wilderness for 3 or 4 generations. They had acquired much of the stoicism of the Indians and inurement of primitive outdoor living that made them almost as wild as the red men. His old woman," in quotes, "could endure harsh privations as well as the Indian squaw and was far more fruitful. He ate the Indians' corn and jerked meat, He wore the Indians' deerskin clothes. He even adopted the tomahawk. And here only, on the rampaging frontier, the white border man collected scalps with all the zest of the Choctaw brave. Appalachian scholar Stephen Pearson is one of the very few intellectuals from the region to refute the concept of white Appalachians being indigenous and colonized. The colonial model, he writes, maintains that white Appalachians positioned as the region's indigenous population are the victims of a form of colonialism analogous to that dominating American Indian nations. As such, the colonialism model of Appalachia exploitation calls for the decolonization of Appalachia. He notes that the Appalachian case offers an excellent illustration of how settlers can employ indigenization in late settler colonial contexts in order to negotiate land claims and other inequalities among white settlers. The Appalachian case shows that even in the late settler colonies, Native presence remains an unsettling factor, challenging the legitimacy of ongoing settler occupancy. Appalachian scholars developed and refined Caudille's racist work, using the internal colonialism theoretical context, going further than Caudille and portraying white settlers as indigenous people. In 1978, scholarly articles were published in the book Colonialism in Modern America, The Appalachian Case, which remains a fundamental text in Appalachian studies. Pearson writes that in the flagship essay of the collection written by Helen Lewis and Edward Knight, the authors refer to the white residents as, quote, the indigenous population, unquote, while those of the residents who align themselves with the coal companies are designated as, quote, natives who become colonizers of their own people, unquote. They write of the colonizers manifesting racism against an indigenous population, the white Appalachian, referring to the settler population, which the authors refer to as the colonized. The authors analogize regional development organizations as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, claiming that the white population lives, quote, on the Appalachian reservation. Pearson notes that this is a comparison also made by other white Appalachian scholars. Most disturbing is that Lewis and Knight treat the original invasion of the Scots-Irish squatters as peaceful settlement rather than genocidal violence. They portray an empty landscape that settlers occupied, the indigenous people somehow having disappeared, with white settlers inheriting indigeneity and the land. In another anthology, Edward Guillen writes, the Appalachian region, whose indigenous Cherokee integrated, educated, and nursed the exiled Celtic arrivals into maturity, wisdom, and community. Julie, nicknamed Judy Bonds, is a well-known activist opposing mountaintop removal and has stated that, quote, we're a distinct mountain culture and our culture means something. This is a culture that has been handed down to us all the way from the Native Americans. David Weissner, whom historian Stephen Stoll acknowledges as one of the, quote, historians of Appalachia, whose work I read and admire, characterizes his scholarly mission as being one of Frantz Fanon's Native intellectuals in a colony going through decolonization. Another Appalachian scholar, Roger Cunningham, asserts that, quote, all Native Appalachian scholarship, including mine, is like that of other colonized peoples in being engaged with history and praxis. Pearson observes that, quote, the colonialism model has allowed white liberals within the region and really the whole country to valorize themselves as indigenous leaders in a struggle for decolonization a super secessionist settler colonial fantasy come to fruition. So there you have settler colonialism. I would add one thing that is really important to understand is the difference between immigrants who start coming in the 1870s and 1880s. They come to an already established polity. It's already in place. They have to find ways to adjust to it. And it's very difficult, especially for those who didn't speak English or who were very dark, like Southern Europe, Italians. And so they're put through this Americanization ringer to really make them into settlers. So the real point of the book is for immigrants and children of immigrants to work at not becoming settlers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You anticipated my first question, and before we get started, I just wanted to encourage our audience to post their questions in the Q&A function. Thank you so much for clarifying this idea of self-indigenization of settlers in the Appalachian context, and also differentiating it from Phil Deloria's playing Indian metaphor. And you anticipated my question about, which you addressed in the conclusion to your book, about the difference between settlers and immigrants. And you conclude by saying that one of the unspoken requirements for immigrants and their descendants is to become fully American. In writing this book, what has been one of the most rewarding things for you in bringing together stories of indigenous dispossession and exclusion, along with Asian exclusion and Southern and Eastern European immigrant exclusion and indigenous people?
Well, I think the thing that most surprised me and really gave me certain optimism about the future is that in 1965, finally, the United States, instead of having an exclusion, practically a blanket exclusion of anyone who wasn't Western European, and that started, in 1924. Very, very tight quotas opened it up to the developing world, Latin America. So these newer immigrants who have come from the third world, many of them have written memoirs, have written stories that it's a beautiful collection of literature that I found. I mean, it wasn't hiding, but I just hadn't known about it before. And also articles in which they're very cognizant that they're on, they don't use the terminology settler colonialism necessarily, but they're on other people, native, they're aware. And that I attribute to the hard work of Native American scholars and activists in your face, bringing these, the Standing Rock demonstrations, the ones going on now around the pipeline, and the environmental movement. It's a very much indigenous peoples. So that's very encouraging, because in the past, I have a whole chapter how the Italians became settlers and also self-indigenized by identifying with Columbus. Sure. As as a Catholic and as an Italian. There was no Italy at the time of Columbus. He was from the city-state of Genoa. And he didn't stay, he was an immigrant, but he is conceived, before that, even at the founding, even before the founding of the United States, as the pioneer founder, even though he never came, on the continent at all. So the Knights of Columbus, the Irish group, the Knights of Columbus, the Catholic group that formed in 1882 to start, celebrating the 400-year anniversary of Columbus, helped Americanize Italians by presenting this. You are descended directly. So this is why they cling so desperately to Columbus. It was headed to them as the idea of they could be a pure indigenous American by identifying with Columbus. So it's almost heartbreaking, really, to see their reliance on this mythology. And of course, a lot of younger Italian young people
Absolutely.
are working against that. So it's changing.
Absolutely. The Italian American Studies Association had all sorts of panels last year during the pandemic addressing this issue, and it's an important conversation in the field of immigration studies as they wrestle with the idea of their own complicity in settler coloniality. We have maybe 4 questions and more trickling in. So as I promised, I will address them as they come in. I will start with Anita Nadeau. Thank you for your question. I would like to know what Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz thinks about about the white nationalists using the federal courthouse as a new platform to protest, spread hate, and promote white supremacy in Charlottesville this week.
Yes, the white nationalists came from out from under their rocks with Trump. He no dog whistles for Trump. Like Reagan. Reagan brought them out in the 1980s, but then the Oklahoma City bombing sort of, calmed them down. They kind of withdrew. But these are the descendants of the original settlers, with some pretenders, that actually are children of immigrants, but sort of pretend to be original. But they are majority. I grew up in rural Oklahoma, so I know I know some now. I actually had, and my father's family, Dunbar, is Scots-Irish from Appalachia. So I have insider knowledge. I can recognize them. I studied very closely the videos of the insurrection of January 6th. There were a lot of up close faces, and I could really recognize almost some facial features of members of my family. So these are descendants of the original settlers who believe this is their country. The hatred for immigrants is precisely that they are always contingent in the settler mind, that they're never real Americans unless they can date their ancestors' arrival before U.S. independence. And this is so deep, and of course it's very, very deep in the old southern, the old states in Virginia and in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, but especially Virginia. That was the basically what became the United States was the Virginians who called all the shots. The Three-Fifth Clause and the maintenance of slavery, the Second Amendment, and everything else. And the Constitution itself was written. So Virginia is still a focal point, and it's the Confederacy is another aspect of it, but the Confederacy is no longer just the South, because Southerners migrated to and settled and bought ranches in the Intermountain West. Idaho is filled with, these are are predominantly white old settler descendants. And in the Northwest, California, Central Valley, the agricultural ranching lands. So they have been able to, they're not new. They really rose up during the civil rights movement. These right-wing groups started forming. White citizens councils started forming after the desegregation decisions, Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And all the time that we, my generation, were anti-Vietnam War, women's liberation, and anti-racist and internationalists, anti-apartheid, we were soaring, with our mass demonstrations and all. These people were also at work. And you see that little by little, they've now taken the Supreme Court.
Absolutely.
And the Republican Party.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the next few questions actually connect to what you've just said, and I'm sure you followed the news. Virginia has just elected Republican governor after a decade or so, and there's real concern about our system of education. So one of our graduate students, Jessica Cassie here, asks, you mentioned the idea of a settler move to innocence. I'm wondering if you could expand on that, and if you think that the American public school system is complicit in its affirmation. And Oliver Speck, a little down, asks, all of what you just said might soon be banned at public schools here in Virginia as unpatriotic. And he asks, do you have any suggestions for resisting the whitewashing of American history? How do we do it, especially in this political climate?
Yeah, it's, so many of us have been working on this, and Native scholars have been in the forefront of putting through the understanding of settler colonialism, and Black scholars have been, not new, but 4 decades of scholarly work, developing an understanding of racial capitalism, and the capitalism being built on racial basis, and then the Constitution itself, completely white people that wrote it for white people, its rights, and the idea that these structures can by themselves just go away, is a fantasy. It isn't possible. So I think those who are attacking, I think because of the demonstrations last year and their popularity, even in Oklahoma, my home state, I don't live there. I live in exile in San Francisco. But I was stunned to see really I think I know every radical in Oklahoma, but there were many more than that. And also in Idaho and Montana and these places in North Dakota and all. And I think this really terrified the right, that that we, people like me, have really gotten into and we have, we've been working at it, an educational system that tells the truth instead of what many of us grew up with is lies about everything, and fairy tales, and that we learn differently, and so people have, several generations now have had access to the truth, and I don't think you can stuff it back in the bottle. I don't think you can take that away from those, but they want to stop it and then demonize, anyone who tries to teach this, or at every level. So, yeah, the public universities are really threatened. And in my home state, University of Oklahoma, I have several young PhDs now teaching who are really wonderful, you know, and of course there's ethnic studies and native studies now, and they've, you know, made a law barring the teaching of what they fantasize critical race theory to be. It only, you know, it's just the opposite of what they say. They say it will make white children feel bad. It's just the opposite. It says it's not your fault. It's structural. It's
Right, but you benefit from the structure.
Yes, you are not guilty. You know, but you have to resist it because the structure will make you into a racist, you know. But it's not, that's not how you're born. Because you're white, you're not a racist. It's the structure you're born into that you had no control over. So it actually frees you from guilt. And so you could be angry instead, you know, that this exists, and it has a hold on you that you don't want, you know. And so I think it's liberating rather than shaming. I think too much of that goes on, you know, with some of this trainings and everything, guilt tripping, and individuals try the corporate thing that goes on. I think that does tend to make people, but that's not what critical race theory is. That's something else.
Usually people who complain about it don't really know what it is. What I've noticed in my own classes is that students are angry, and because, you know, after reading your book, not at your book, they are angry because they feel betrayed for not being taught this history. And there's that sense of betrayal, and then the sense of action, right? So what do we do now? And so I think this could be a nice segue into Jesse Goldstein's question about the connection you see between settler indigenization and the land grant universities as placemaking and erasing institutions. And I hesitated to give a land acknowledgement before your talk. I wanted to welcome you to the, you know, lands of the Powhatan Confederacy. We have a faculty working group at the Humanities Research Center on land acknowledgement, and we're trying to understand how we can do this in a respectful way and not just in a performative way, right, to actually mean what we say. So do you see any connections between settler indigenization and the land grant universities as placemaking and erasing institutions? Thank you, Jesse, for your question.
You know, I mentioned the Moral Act and the which empowered and took the land illegally, breaking treaties. So it's really, you know, when I taught for a couple of years at University in New Mexico, I would tell people this is, you know, it's a land grant university, and land was taken from the Sandia Pueblo. And that these were my arguments for getting funds for Native American studies. This was like in the late 1970s. So it wasn't such a thing yet, you know, that that people really, you know, Anglo New Mexicans were disturbed, you know. They really didn't know that. They simply did not know about, you know, because everyone thinks the land grant universities, they're just wonderful. What a wonderful thing, you know, established educational institution. So there's, you know, the High Country News, which is a wonderful weekly newspaper, did you can Google it and find their project on the land grant universities. They have all the specifics. They name each one, you know, and the year it came about and what part of it, like Cornell is half land grant and half private. So you can, you know, and I'm sure VCU is right there, you know, was studied as well. So that's a really great resource to have. It's up on their website. I don't think there's been any kind of criticism that anything is wrong in their analysis. So it's a template to use and to get in contact with other schools. I think it's, rather than just focusing on your own, other land-grant institutions in your region at least, but somehow develop a movement that is interlocking, and brings awareness, because the students who go to these universities, which I did, I didn't know this, the source, the origin. There's something inherently good about a university that you're grateful for, and to find this sort of rot underneath, is I think it's shocking to students, and they want to do something about it. It activates them.
I think the journal NACE, also Native American and Indigenous Studies, recently did a special issue on land-grant universities, land-grant universities. So, so thank you for offering those resources. We have 2 more questions, and I will start with another graduate student who actually read a lot of your work and is in my graduate class on Indigenous boarding schools right now. So Zeri Trosper says, I thought it was very important when you mentioned how Obama in his inaugural speech referred to Black Americans as being part of the settler identity. I'm of the belief that this was incredibly responsible of him. In your opinion, where do Black individuals exist in this dichotomy of settler native or settler immigrant?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My second chapter in the book, or the third chapter, sorry, is called arrivants. And this is a term that a Caribbean poet invented, that I found through Chickasaw scholar Judy Bonds' Transit of Empire, which I highly recommend. It's a brilliant book. That it's people who arrive without agency, without the agency of arrival. They wouldn't have come if they weren't in chains and forced to. So a settler is someone who chooses, to come. And so there's no way in which Africans, however, Africans who immigrate, Black people who immigrate to the United States, again, I found some memoirs and some books from them, some Somalians and others who are kind of shocked when they come. Many of them come as refugees. I mean, the U.S. creates so many refugees through the wars, so they don't take enough refugees, but they come as refugees, so they don't have a choice of where they're going to be placed at first, anyway. And so they place them in already existing Black communities often, and they feel no kind of connection, because to them, Black was the norm. It's not something unusual, and they come from a different culture. So it's they talk about how they actually can develop racism just like white people, white immigrants can, by just the rhetoric around the dysfunction of Black communities, being colonized people. So I think it's important to understand that Obama is not descendant from US enslaved people. His father was an immigrant, actually a foreign student on a student visa. So he worked at and married into a definitely hardcore descendants of enslaved people with his wife Michelle's family. But he had to learn that rhetoric, and it doesn't come natural to him. So I think he simply has the mentality of a settler. or an immigrant who hasn't, hasn't really looked at himself. He did an interview with a Doha radio station early in his first administration. And the interviewer said, "Do you really think the United States can be a fair broker in the Palestine-Israeli conflict?" And he says, "Absolutely we can, because look at us. The United States is never a colonizer. And we're free of that, that mindset." So his self-delusion, is, I think it made him, people thought they were voting for a Black president. And I think he wasn't really, he really seemed to not want to deal with that role and rejected his wonderful pastor, who was outspoken about colonialism and racism and all. Yeah. So anyway, that was a disappointment to many people.
Right. Thank you for your answer. I don't know if we have time. Do we have time to take 2 more questions, or should we just take 1?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Oh. Hi, it's
okay. Let's go to Sean Williams. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for your generous time with us tonight. Sean Williams asks whether you have any thoughts on the ways refugees of U.S. intervention and imperialism you just mentioned often seek assimilation, and if they too could become settlers if they're not careful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting, the Asian American community. I live in San Francisco, is 50% Chinese Americans, but there are also a lot of Chinese immigrants, and a lot of Southeast Asian refugees too. So in my teaching career, I had a lot of interaction with Asians, and I mentioned in my talk this desire of the founding fathers to control China. This goes way back to the Middle Ages in the West. I didn't know it went back so far until I wrote this book and started researching it. It's Marco Polo that brought this, came back and said, these people are so organized, and no, they don't have a military, but they're so organized, they could have a military and take over the world, and so this fear, came to be called yellow peril, is still so deep in the West, and the United States has picked up and has warships surrounding on every coast of China. And, it's a nuclear power, and this is terrifying. So anyway, Chinese here, Chinese Americans take the brunt of this anti-Chinese rhetoric that's been going on for the past 10 years, and including this new administration that China's in the, is in the crosshairs of the United States now. So there's a lot of fear, and so but there's a deep understanding, of what the United States is, even though people would prefer to assimilate because they're here, and no one wants their kids to be made fun of or bullied or whatever, you want to fit in. But because there's this pushing away, there is a lot of, understanding and knowledge, deep knowledge. And I found some of the literature also amazing, really amazing Asian American literature of the last decade or so. It's just a fantastic archive. But especially the very famous celebrities on Viet Nguyen, who wrote The Surrounded and the Committed Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
He wrote a book, a nonfiction book that not many people read, and I keep telling people to read it. It's Nothing Ever Dies. And it's really a series of essays. It's on the Vietnam War. His family were on the U.S. side. His father was a South Vietnamese army officer. So they were refugees, but they were on the side. So some, because those were the main refugees who came, they're pretty conservative, and pro-American. But some of the younger people coming through are experiencing that anti-Asian, stuff and become, shall I say, woke, just to be mean. So this book is so interesting. He actually does calculations that show the majority of people that the United States calls immigrants are refugees, that probably 3/4 are refugees from US wars.
Yeah.
So this is the US is almost a manufacturer of refugees. There are millions of Afghan refugees. They only took 30,000 in the United States. There are 2 million in Pakistan, 1.5 million in Iran from the US war there. So I think his book is so, his mentality, and because he has this standing now, he has a big platform, and he understands the colonial character of the United States, and is very outspoken in his analysis and the militarism that's inherent. So I think that's a really important book to read. But he also tells of the trauma of these refugees, the Cambodian and the Laotian, Vietnamese refugees, the trauma of war refugees, and that it's something that writing, promoting writing, and Maxine Hong Kingston really started this trend, especially for vets. Writing is an important way to deal with trauma, and so a lot of that of his literature is exposing that, what this does, and you really feel it. So I really recommend reading that book and understand. I use it quite a bit in my book. I quote from it generously.
Yes, so Nothing Ever Dies.
Yes, Nothing Ever Dies.
Thank you so much. And we have one last question from John Glover, who is our humanities librarian. He asks, well, first of all, thank you for this fascinating and unsettling talk. Have you seen new forms of self-indigenization, new kinds of self-indigenizing language emerging under and after Trump? And he also mentions that our screens have been filled with naked racism and violence, and he wonders what we may sometimes be overlooking. Thank you, John.
Yeah, well, certainly these white nationalists are, it's not new, they're self-indigenizing, they are the originals. And often they will, in this kind of phony way, claim they and the Indians, or like their buddies or something. It's like not the case. So there's that. But the other, I deal with 2 or 3 other cases. One is ranchers and indigeneity. If you remember the Malheur takeover, where they were all freed. Here's a 6-week insurrection taking over federal property, and no one is, they went to trial, but the juries found them innocent. And there was a lot of sympathy for them, and this was Northern Paiute land that the federal government has. It's gradually being shifted the stewardship back to the Northern Paiute, and that was less known about that. But before that, they run their cattle. They never pay their very small amounts that the federal government runs. They're ruining the federal lands with overgrazing. And they're rich. They're hugely rich people. Many of them are Mormons. So that Mormon religion has a self-indigenizing narrative to it. Also the Hispanos of New Mexico, who that was one of the few, it was the first settler colonialism in North America was the Spanish before the British were even here. In 1598, they colonized New Mexico and made it into a settler state. They tried to ethnically cleanse. They reduced the Pueblo Indians from 100,000 to 10,000 in 30 years, a genocide, and took their land. They were they're irrigation farmers, and very successful. Corn, squash, and beans, and and had city states. There were 99. Now there are 21. So they're still there, but the Hispanos, the descendants who have that land, they lost a lot of it when the United States took over. But they have claims, that they're pursuing to get their colonized land back. So there's this sense that they consider it home, that they should be accepted as indigenous people. And they're not even really part native. I mean, they were mostly Basque people who came. So they also try to kind of fold themselves into the truly colonized Mexican thing. And so I deal with that and the ranchers. So there are several examples like that, but in general, there's a sense of empty land, the mythology of the hunter. Native people were intensive farmers, they created in the Western Hemisphere almost every vegetable known to mankind. The rest were invented in Africa and China, certainly not Europe. None of them. They didn't know what a vegetable was until they started colonizing people. So this is this mythology, which I dealt with in Indigenous peoples' history of this agrarian civilizations that. So because this idea of a sparsely populated place, and then a kind of saying, it's tragic that, they kind of all died off. The real Indians all died off. But here we are, this great democracy and everything to replace it, so it's erasure in the title of it. So there's the exclusion, and erasure is immigration policy in the United States.
Thank you so much for staying with us to take all these questions. And I will end with what McKenna Brown says here also in Q&A, insightful and provocative. It will nourish much pondering on this topic, and many thanks to you for making time. And if you haven't bought the book, I know many of you have. It just came out a few months ago, and so congratulations, and thank you so much for visiting us today and for your wisdom. Those of you who have friends who couldn't make it, we'll try to have a video of this conversation up as soon as we can. I have just a few words to say in parting. I wanted to remind everyone to mark your calendars for our next event in the HRC speaker series, which is next Thursday, November the 18th at 6 p.m. when we welcome back to VCU Choctaw writer, artist, and filmmaker Lian Hao, who will read from recent work, including her play Savage Conversations that I know many of us have read. And this will be a hybrid event. So she'll be here in person, also sharing her most recent film, a documentary on Sequoia at the Pocahontas Film Festival. And I have a beautiful poster here behind me that I wanted you all to see. Next Friday, the Pocahontas Reframed Film Festival begins in person at the VMFA. And this is its 5th year of existence. And the HRC is very proud to support the festival this year. And I hope to see many of you there. Looking ahead to next semester and to continue the conversation we started with Professor Dunbar-Ortiz today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Kyle Mays from UCLA on February 3rd, who will share with us his most recent book, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, just published this month. So we hope to see many of you and your students at these and future events. Thank you so much, Professor Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. It's such an honor to finally meet you, and it means the world to us that you stuck around and took all the questions. And thank you all for sticking around and for spending this time with us today and for supporting the HRC. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.